Serious, what do you think was the worst war to be the average soldier in? Vietnam War certainly has to be up there. Booby traps led to 11% of US casualties, which were long painful deaths. There was also a lot of hand-to-hand combat which the US soldiers weren't used to. The guerrilla warfare also left most US soldiers in the constant fear of being ambushed. Looking at the Viet Cong side, the US Army's use of napalm led to many soldiers and civilians having their skin burnt off. Just a perspective. The Korean War. Not a lot of people realize how fucked up that war was. My elementary school principal would tell a story about how his buddy nearby had his belly blown open on a battlefield in Korea, and he, the principal, had to put the friend's, intestines back inside to carry the friend to safety. As you may imagine, this was a very memorable story to hear as a sixth grader. I think the worst war is every war for the individual fighting. General Sherman is quoted for the following to the graduates at a military academy: "I've been where you are now and I know just how you feel. It's entirely natural that there should beat in the breast of every one of you a hope and desire that someday you can use the skill you have acquired here. Suppress it. You don't know the horrible aspects of war. I've been through 2 wars and I know. I've seen cities and homes in ashes. I've seen thousands of men lying on the ground, their dead faces looking up at the skies. I tell you, war is hell. Eastern Front, World War II. In a war in which there are no good guys and command has no care about casualties except in the context of victory. Easily should be at the top. Few people know about it, but the Eastern Front includes massive amounts of rape, cannibalism, insane cold, flesh-eating fleas, shooting people who surrender, torture, lack of food and supplies, shooting of medics and Red Cross, insurgent activity, partisans, penal units where human were used to clear minefields by walking in a line arm in arm, and the worst mud. It was bad for both sides in different ways. This was total war, a war of annihilation. Nothing can compare to it in my knowledge. Fighting a modern war with Napoleonic-era tactics doesn't sound fun. What modern war employed Napoleonic-era tactics? Because it certainly was not World War I. Unless loose platoons of riflemen advancing from cover to cover with covering fire from machine guns and mortars, sometimes rushing, sometimes crawling, sometimes following an artillery barrage is your idea of Napoleonic tactics. Those are accurate descriptions of the tactics being used by the end of the war. It took 4 years of stumbling through doctrine to get there. Seriously, read up about the invasion of Belgium, where 30,000 Germans died in a day charging across open fields into machine gun fire over and over and over again without use of cover. They were marching in formation FFS. Soldiers were literally expected to slowly march towards enemy lines under machine gun fire and artillery barrages. Not really. Not even in the earliest months of the war, when admittedly you could easily scratch your head at the clumsy attempts to deal with new battlefield realities, would soldiers be expected to just slowly march when attacking the enemy lines while under fire. And certainly not in the following 3.5 years of war. I would also very much like to see your source for the claim of the practice of decimations, especially as being a notable enough factor to mention it in this context. As for the trenches, you might be interested in this. World War I crosses the line and becomes outright dystopian, with some parts of it sounding straight out of an apocalyptic cosmic horror story. It especially doesn't help that it ended with anywhere from 50 to 100 million people dying from Spanish flu. Take every piss-soaked hellhole of a war you know of, and now take away any possible redeeming factors. No antibiotics, sparse anesthesia, everyone around you dying of some black death the likes of which hasn't been seen in nearly 1,000 years, and you're barefoot and without a gun. You're told to pick up a gun off a dead comrade if you survive long enough to get the chance. You're fighting for nothing except the whims of a bunch of prissy rich nobles and industrialists. You've never seen tanks before until today. You've never experienced mustard gas until today. You've got these frightening aeroplanes and airships infesting the air, attacking you from above. No modern amenities either. No air conditioner or heater. You know that just about every battle will claim several thousand of your countrymen, and yet you keep doing the same damn tactics. You're just cattle, a disposable pawn who's worth even less at home. Then you go home and discover your nation's collapsing in on itself. Maybe you get Bolsheviks who go so far as to say your faith is a lie and demand you shoot your priest and landlords, and it's not like you don't want to, considering all you've been put through. And it's not just your country falling apart, it's all of Europe. Despite total societal breakup seeming imminent, everyone was still fighting. And it's not like there's much hope for you either. You're just going to wind up in one of the slums of the big city, working 18 hours a day 6 days a week for pennies in a godforsaken mill. There's absolutely no hope, no morale among anyone. And then it gets worse. Famine, civil war, terror, economic depression, totalitarianism, all that fun stuff. You can see why some people thought it was the end of days. For the average soldiers, who, in Russia, were considered less than dogs, I think those mowed down in 1914 were the lucky ones. It makes sense that World War II was as brutal as it was considering what the generation that fought it went through. And then you get to the orgy of blood sadomasochism and nigh demonic madness that is World War II. Like, holy shit. That was an industrial murder machine fueled by raw, unfiltered hate. The sheer hate you see in World War II, especially on the Eastern Front, is strange. I say that like how Witchfinder General said Satan is strange. That was humanity at its absolute blackest. Don't forget to add in Japan and their blood flood over in East Asia. I focused on Russia because, the more I learn about the era, the more I realize that Eastern Europe circa 1914 through 1950 was a dystopian whorehouse of ultraviolence. I believe there was a comment that when World War I was the end of civilization, we've just been recovering ever since. Although World War I was probably the most brutal, the Vietnam War has to be up there. Because a lot of the fighting was in the jungles and tunnels, unexpected incidents happened all the time, and soldiers died in seconds by a firefight. Without much wildlife experience, the average soldier would suffer from malnutrition and stuff as well. Horrific as the trenches and charges under hostile fire were, the death rate of soldiers on the Western Front was actually not that high. When there wasn't a major offensive like the Somme or Verdun, there weren't many deaths. 12% of British infantrymen died in 4 years of war, and French and German figures were similar. You had a much lower chance of surviving in many other wars. But that's not really the point. You may survive, sure. But after sitting in a trench for months being bombarded, always looking for deadly gas, bombs coming down and your comrades are dying left and right of you. The anxiety, fear for your life, constant shelling and dead people all around you is what really made the Western Front hell. Try to imagine your 8-hour workday being that, and then try to imagine that for months without stopping in the night or on weekends. You don't come out of these trenches and just go back to being the guy you were before. My great-great-grandfather's unit started out with 285 men. 80% died of exposure and sickness, 15% from combat. My grandfather survived only because he was captured at the second battle he was involved in. 6 months later he was forced to sign a statement of neutrality and sent home. Wasn't peachy for the Japanese either. Banzai charges, more than likely ended up with the Japanese getting taken out by US machine gun fire, at least if they charged troops that were dug in / stationary tunnels. The US used flamethrowers to burn out Japanese troops that were in tunnels. The Japanese might look obedient and disciplined, but there was a problem of infighting or backstabbing, metaphorical, if the troops and officers thought a commander wasn't radical enough. I recommend the movie Letters from Iwo Jima. It's part of a movie series on the Battle of Iwo Jima. Letters from Iwo Jima was from Japanese perspective, Flags of Our Fathers was American perspective. It showed how desperate the war had gotten for the Japanese. Iwo Jima was essentially cut off from supplies and the rest of Japan. They stated that either the navy was obliterated or the carrier fleet was gone, so either air support or naval support wasn't going to happen. Dysentery was present. Once the battle started, you had US forces burning out tunnels with flamethrowers, mowing down banzai charges and steadily advancing further into the island. Not to mention, the Japanese were at the mercy of US airstrikes and naval bombardment, seeing as how they were relatively unchecked because the Japanese navy was essentially gone. While there was a high mortality and harsh conditions in World War I, Napoleonic War and especially the war in Russia was far worse in my opinion, as people were marching on foot from Germany to Moscow and back, losing almost every soldier not from battle but from cold and exhaustion. Not to mention fucking gas. Dan Carlin tells one soldier's story about a British soldier who was hit by a gas attack. The man was tending to a wounded young soldier when the gas struck. Reaching back, he realized that his gas mask had been hit by a bullet and was thus useless. He chose to wrench the gas mask from the boy's face, who was too badly injured to fight back, and left him there. In the man's account, he was haunted by the pleading eyes of the boy for the rest of his life, and understandably so. So brutal. World War I, not because of the weapons, or tactics, but because of the duration and intensity of combat. Earlier and later wars have never had as many soldiers in sustained combat operations for as long a period of time. In prior wars, battles would last days. In World War I, a soldier could be under fire in the trenches for months on end. This is still unprecedented in warfare. Consider that battles in the 19th century that would last no more than a day or two. This level operational tempo would only be approached again in Vietnam, and maybe Afghanistan for the Russians. The average infantryman in the South Pacific during World War II saw about 40 days of combat in 4 years. The average infantryman in Vietnam saw about 240 days of combat in 1 year thanks to the mobility of the helicopter. Could someone please explain the decimations? I've never heard of that. It comes from Roman times. The word decimation roughly translates to removal of a tenth. It was often used as a punishment for mutiny and/or desertion. A large group of soldiers will be divided into groups of 10. Out of each group, one soldier is selected, either by drawing lots, straws, or by vote. The chosen soldier must then be executed by the remaining 9, usually by clubbing or stoning. If you knew that you could be killed by your own comrades or be forced to kill your friend, should you desert your post? Would you dare disobey orders? The Pacific Front of the Second World War takes the cake. If you say US/Vietnam because of the jungle, and because of the savage tactics, then the Pacific has that beat. If you say the Western Front due to the likes of D-Day, then again, the Pacific was far worse, e.a. Iwo Jima landings. If you say the First World War due to trench foot and shell shock, in my opinion the closest contender, then hear me out. In the Pacific, too, trench foot was rampant. And so was flesh-eating diseases. Both sides had to endure severe heat and lack of water, as well as debilitating sunburns. In the jungle, the humidity made any wound prone to infection, and man-killing insects were a serious problem. A primary concern was simply dying of diarrhea. When it wasn't blisteringly hot, it was relentlessly downpouring for days without end. When it rained, it was far worse than Europe in the First World War. Soldiers had to fight against trench foot, keeping their foxholes from being submerged, and had to deal with buried bodies being re-exposed by the rain and washing into their foxholes. All this, and I haven't mentioned the giant coconut crabs that would find their way into foxholes. As for the warfare, it was just as bad as any 20th century war and then some. The Japanese in many cases had severely depleted rations, going days on small portions of rice and coconut, and little water. These men had to live in mud-ridden holes and tunnels prone to collapse. They were digging their graves. For the Allied forces as well, the living conditions were deplorable. The Japanese would have to charge headlong into certain death with outdated weaponry, and the US soldiers were kept up all night by the sporadic charge of a Japanese soldier intent on stabbing a GI while he sleeps. US soldiers would cook human beings with flamethrowers to flush them out of hiding holes, while the Japanese soldiers would install pits and traps to impale their enemy, or rig dead bodies with explosives. Civilians, specifically babies, were rigged as well. The Japanese had to lay in wait for weeks, shitting and eating inside cramped holes and holding in like ticks against the soldiers outside trying to tear them out. American invaders would have to cross sharp coral reefs in amphibious landings, some drowning and the rest being torn apart by machine gun fire and artillery. Speaking of the artillery, both sides were relentless in the bombardment of the other, as in any modern war. The biggest factor to the brutality of this war was the nature of it. This was a war of hatred, fueled by prejudice. Both sides viewed the other as non-human, or less than human. It was also a war without mercy. The Allied forces were quick to realize that surrender was not an option for the Empire of Japan. Those Japanese soldiers who did surrender did so with a primed grenade behind their back. As such, and compounding with the prejudice and hatred, the reality of the war became kill or be killed. The treatment of prisoners on either side was awful, and in most cases execution was the preferred course of action over securing a prisoner. US soldiers would take trophies: ears, fingers, teeth, especially gold teeth. Skulls would decorate tanks in some cases, and Japanese bones would be carved into spoons and other souvenirs. Scalping of the Japanese was not uncommon. As for American soldiers facing encapturement, mutilation was far from uncommon. Explosives would sometimes be buried in the bodies of still living Allied soldiers and airmen. The war crimes of this war were unlike any other seen in modern history, and one could write an entire article just listing them. Then you have the treatment of civilians by both sides. Stuck in the middle of this war, many of the Pacific natives or Chinese and Vietnamese civilians were killed in crossfire, or intentionally, in some cases forced to fight for the empire, used as bayonet practice for the Japanese recruits, rigged with explosives or sent at Allied forces in the pitch of combat, and prostituted by both sides. By far, the worst off in this war were the Chinese. The Chinese were massacred by the Japanese, their homes burned down, possessions raided, and an above-average number of the women were raped, and many Chinese were imprisoned or forced into brutal marches and relocations. 18 million Chinese non-combatants were killed, and the rest had to face the bloody toils of war and dislocation or dissolution of family. The Pacific was a war of hate and prejudice, and a war without mercy. It was the horrors of modernized war combined with brutal primitiveness, the likes of which were the lowest that mankind could muster. Combine that with intolerable environmental conditions, disease, and malnutrition, and you have the worst war for the average soldier. And even worse for many non-soldiers. Well written. This reminds me of Septon Meribald's Broken Man soliloquy by George R.R. Martin in his A Feast for Crows novel. "Sir? My lady," said Podrick. "Is a broken man an outlaw?" "More or less," Brienne answered. Septon Meribald disagreed. "More less than more. There are many sorts of outlaws, just as there are many sorts of birds. A sandpiper and a sea eagle both have wings, but they are not the same. The singers love to sing of good men forced to go outside the law to fight some wicked lord, but most outlaws are more like this ravening hound than they are the lightning lord. They are evil men, driven by greed, soured by malice, despising the gods and caring only for themselves. Broken men are more deserving of our pity, though they may be just as dangerous. Almost all are common-born, simple folk who had never been more than a mile from the house where they were born. Until the day some lord came round to take them off to war. Poorly shod and poorly clad, they march away beneath his banners, ofttimes with no better arms than a sickle or a sharpened hoe, or a maul they made themselves by lashing a stone to a stick with strips of hide. Brothers march with brothers, sons with fathers, friends with friends. They've heard the songs and stories, so they go off with eager hearts, dreaming of the wonders they will see, of the wealth and glory they will win. War seems a fine adventure, the greatest most of them will ever know. Then they get a taste of battle. For some, that one taste is enough to break them. Others go on for years, until they lose count of all the battles they have fought in, but even a man who has survived 100 fights can break in his 101st. Brothers watch their brothers die, fathers lose their sons, friends see their friends trying to hold their entrails in after they've been gutted by an axe. They see the Lord who led them there cut down, and some other Lord shouts that they are his now. They take a wound, and when that's still half healed they take another. There is never enough to eat, their shoes fall to pieces from the marching, their clothes are torn and rotting, and half of them are shitting in their breeches from drinking bad water. If they want new boots or a warmer cloak or maybe a rusted iron half-helm, they need to take them from a corpse, and before long they are stealing from the living too, from the small folk whose lands they're fighting in, men very like the men they used to be. They slaughter their sheep and steal their chickens, and from there it's just a short step to carrying off their daughters too. And one day they look around and realize all their friends and kin are gone. That they are fighting beside strangers beneath a banner that they hardly recognize. They don't know where they are or how to get back home, and the Lord they're fighting for does not know their names, yet here he comes, shouting for them to form up, to make a line with their spears and scythes and sharpened hoes, to stand their ground. And the knights come down on them, faceless men clad all in steel, and the iron thunder of their charge seems to fill the world. And the man breaks. He turns and runs, or crawls off afterward over the corpses of the slain, or steals away in the black of night, and he finds some place to hide. All thought of home is gone by then, and kings and lords and gods mean less to him than a haunch of spoiled meat that will let him live another day, or a skin of bad wine that might drown his fear for a few hours. The broken man lives from day to day, from meal to meal, more beast than man. Lady Brienne is not wrong. In times like these, the traveller must beware of broken men, and fear them, but he should pity them as well. When Meribald was finished, a profound silence fell upon their little band. Brienne could hear the wind rustling through a clump of pussy willows, and farther off the faint cry of a loon. She could hear Dog panting softly as he loped along beside the Septon and his donkey, tongue lolling from his mouth. The quiet stretched and stretched, until finally she said, "How old were you when they marched you off to war?" "Why, no older than your boy," Meribald replied. "Too young for such, in truth, but my brothers were all going, and I would not be left behind. Willem said I could be his squire, though Will was no knight, only a potboy armed with a kitchen knife he'd stolen from the inn. He died upon the stepstones, and never struck a blow. It was fever did for him, and for my brother Robin. Owen died from a mace that split his head apart, and his friend John Pox was hanged for rape." "The War of the Ninepenny Kings?" asked Hilehunt. "So they called it, though I never saw a king, nor earned a penny. It was a war, though. That it was. Definitely World War I, it took years for the generals to catch up to the tech that had been created since the last major war in Europe, around 1870. As a result, generals sent their men in charges that were mowed down by machine guns. Tens of thousands of people died a day when major offensives occurred. Battles like the Somme and Verdun saw the worst of this. Furthermore, artillery had improved so much that soldiers were under a constant artillery barrage. It was so bad that it was expected to lose a good portion of your troops that you sent in to simply reinforce your soldiers, before they even got to the trenches. The Russians had it particularly bad. They had something like the industrial production of 30,000 artillery shells a month, and at times were using that amount a day. The Italians and Austrians fought at high altitude in a series of numbered battles, so even if you got injured you had to be carried down a bloody mountain. It was so bad they are still finding bodies that are being defrosted due to global warming. I think the worst part was the shelling. Soldiers on the Western and the Eastern Front faced a constant saturation barrage. Can you imagine being barrages by huge weapons that could shoot for 10 to 20 miles all day? Even the most stable person would lose it under those conditions. Then to top it all off, when the soldiers, that were lucky enough to survive, came home, they were just expected to rejoin society with no help from the government and little to none government assistance as veterans. World War I was hell. The shifty peace established by the British and French created a system that made World War II inevitable. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. I have a degree in American history with an emphasis on the 20th century. Edit, forgot the gas. It became common practice to mix your firing with a combination of mustard gas shells, shrapnel shells, think pineapple grenade, and explosive rounds. Such a massive amount of ammo used, there are still areas of France that you are advised not to go due to unexploded ordnance. My vote would probably go to one of the Peninsular Wars, particularly the naval battles. There are accounts of Trafalgar where Spanish ships had been shot through end to the extent that inside the ship nobody has survived, and the interior surfaces were smeared floor to ceiling with gore from people smashed like eggs by tons of shot. Add to that the fact that many of the sailors on both sides were forcibly pressed into service. After the battle, the story goes that a Spanish sailor from Cadiz was captured, still wearing the Harlequin costume he was wearing when he had been pressed into service. And rifling. Between the improvements in wide-scaled rifling and ammunition, paired with Napoleonic tactics meant for round shot and smoothbore muskets, the casualty rate was astronomical. Whenever tactics are outpaced by technology, infantry gets the short end of the stick. Any sort of naval battle prior to modern medicine. Splinters and shrapnel coming at you, including unsterilized cooking utensils. Nope. Oh, you're hit? Guess what? There's nowhere to go other than off the boat, into the hands of the enemy, or the sweet embrace of agonizing death. You can't be properly treated because modern medicine doesn't exist. Better drink rum and pray. Doesn't seem at all like fun. Except for the sea shanties. Eastern Front World War II hands down. Literally a meat grinder for 4 years. Vietnam was pretty brutal, not so much for number of casualties or living conditions, but going to fight a war that no one back home cared about or respected at the time. The psychological effect of a hidden enemy among the jungle canopy and being hamstrung by rules of engagement / not being able to strike back many times, fighting bloody hard-fought battles to take pieces of ground only to turn around and give it back to fight over it another day. It wasn't employed often in World War I, mainly a particular Italian unit according to some other redditors, although I cannot recall it ever being used in way, although the Romans used it quite often. It's a punishment for cowardice where 1 out of every 10 men would be beaten to death by their own comrades, or shot in the case of World War I. They drew lots to decide the unfortunate victim. The First Anglo-Afghan War. Specifically with the British in 1842 on the retreat from Kabul to Jalalabad. The retreat was a disaster from the start. Not that the beginning of the war was a glorious start. Around 16,000 people retreated, about 4,500 troops, the rest part of the baggage train. The leading officers quibbled and argued for 3 days as the Afghans picked off the baggage. By the time they left it was too late. The passes were framed on the high ground with tribesmen armed with bullseyes, not sure on the spelling, typing on my phone, long-range muskets. Over the next few days the British were torn apart by repeated attacks by tribesmen and cavalry. They pretty much abandoned their baggage train. If a musket ball, lance or sword didn't get the average soldier, the freezing cold would. There were multiple points the Indian sepoys attempted to surrender were executed on the spot. British officers were often lured into talks to allow the column to pass and were murdered. Towards the end there were a handful of officers left, bearing in mind, most of them would have been junior officers in their first combat. Not used to tactics and violence. The intelligence available to the British about Afghanistan was woefully low. Due to a lot of senior officers ignoring their exploring and diplomatic officers. The final company left able to fight was part of the 44th. The last fight is referred to as the last stand of the 44th. Although in reality it was about 20 officers and 20 men from various regiments. All in tatters, tired, and a handful of shots between them. They were slaughtered to about 10 men when they refused to surrender. This lack of surrender was probably not some heroic/idiotic display of courage, but more a fear of what would happen to them in the hands of the Afghans. There was one man, as the story goes, who made it to British-held Jalalabad. An assistant surgeon called William Brydon. There is some speculation as to whether some sepoys or private soldiers managed to slip through. It's often described as the worst and most embarrassing defeat to the British military ever. Let's not forget the abysmal living condition in trenches. Yes, but it's a myth that people sat in the trenches for months and years on end without moving. They were rotated in and out roughly every 10 days, so they got to go behind the lines where life was mostly normal. They wrote home, ate out, had baths, etc. Also shell shock and shooting people with shell shock for not being able to fight. Today known as PTSD. Not really. What they called shell shock is now called combat stress reaction. It is the immediate effects of extended stress and combat on the mind and body, including extreme fatigue, shakes and tremors, paranoia, headaches, nausea, nightmares, and insomnia. Having CSR can be, but isn't always, a precursor to post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have CSR and never experience PTSD, and you can have PTSD without having experienced CSR. Apologies for any grammar/spelling error. English is not my first language. Mustard gas. That is all. When I was a boy in the 60s and 70s, there was an older cousin of my dad's who we were close with. He was a World War I vet and his eyes were damaged from mustard gas. He could see, but he wore those cock bottle bottom type lenses. He could drive and made his living as a farmer until he was very old, but his eyes bothered him. As an aside, he and his wife lived in an old farmhouse that had been in their family for generations and there was no plumbing. They had the old classic outhouse and had to get their water from a well. We used to spend time there in the summers and I thought as a kid that was better than Disney World. Most definitely. Even the slightest injury could be a death sentence if infected. In Ken Burns' The Civil War, the historian Shelby Foote commented on why so many pictures of dead soldiers showed them with their shirts and pants undone. He said they were checking for gut wounds. Because abdominal wounds would often open the intestines, people were sure this was a death sentence and they were terrified of it. We need gas masks so we don't get burned up or drowned from the inside. I've got a better idea. How about instead you urinate on this strip of cloth and then wrap it around your mouth and nose? This statement, which sounds effectively like a colorful way of telling a person to go fuck himself, was real and serious military solution. That had to be horrific. There is not much good going on around you while fighting a war anyway, but to look across from you and see your brother, uncle, cousin, best friend standing there. I have nothing but sympathy for both sides when it comes to this.
Very true. My family was very poor during the 19th century and had a lot of kids. I had 9 great-somethings uncles and 2 great-great-great-grandfathers serve. 7 Confederates and 5 Union soldiers. It really depended on whether you were in the North or South whose side you would join. The Mongol conquests. It's basically a death sentence. And the Mongols pretty much sacked one of the greatest centers for knowledge in the Middle East. They murdered pretty much the entire opposing army, and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, as well as burning down libraries and other sources of knowledge.
Hey guys, this is the Rogue YouTuber here. I recently had a big change in my life. I had a baby daughter. Here she is. If you could do me a favor and remember to hit the subscribe button and bang the bell, I'm hoping to really create a YouTube channel that really gets people excited and brings people the best, most interesting content collated from across the internet. I'm saving up to save my little girl to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department. So please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.